One of the really cool capabilities within Azure is its support of SQL Server. Now that really comes in two different flavors, both infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. At the infrastructure level, you very simply create virtual machines that have SQL Server installed on them, either because that's part of the image that you use when you created the virtual machine from a gallery, or because you've installed a Windows virtual machine and you've installed the SQL Server on top of that manually. And there's some differences in terms of licensing, but that's really outside the scope of what we're going to deal with. We're just talking about things in general. Alternatively, we have SQL Server as a database as a service. And what that is, that's going to be SQL Server that's provided to you, and all you need to do is create your database. You specify that you want a server, then you specify that on that server you want to create a database, and here are the specs for the performance metrics of the database, and that's it. And then you start working with that database. So much of the infrastructure, of the work, of the configuration is done for you that it really allows you as a developer to focus on what you need to do most, which is work with data. Love this capability. All right, now, in terms of working with this, what are some features? First of all, you create, now actually should say both, you create a logical server and then you create one or more database instances on that logical server. Okay? And so I can have a server that I create and then spin up my databases just as you would if you already had the original server, or if you had the server and you were controlling it completely. Right? But it's much easier to do than, say, installing SQL Server. Now, you also have firewall capabilities, some really basic, very cool capabilities to protect your data, set up firewalls so that only certain IP addresses or IP address ranges can communicate with your database. Very nice stuff there. All right? And you can also, by the way, of course, use the SQL Server database service. As I said, you can also create a standalone SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machine. Totally fine. Now, one of the really cool things, actually regardless of how you spin up, whether you use infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, to spin up SQL Server is that the tools that you are familiar with, if you are familiar with the SQL Server tools, are going to work against the SQL Server implementation in Azure the same way it will, or mostly the same way it will, as an on-premise. So you can use the tools like SQL Server data tools that are in Visual Studio, the Azure, there's actually a database management portal. You've got SQL Server Management Studio that you can use to connect to a database instance. Again, whether that's on a SQL Server that's installed on a virtual machine that you're controlling, or if you're using Azure SQL databases, you can still connect directly to those using tools that you are familiar with, which again is very cool, making it very easy for you to migrate workloads, SQL workloads into Azure and to offload some of the administrative overhead and burden that may be associated with those SQL Server workloads.